Yep. Can I now welcome everybody to the start of the next session? I'm the moderator. I'm the Speaker of the British House of Commons. My name's Lindsay. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the third session on funding global policies for climate. I am now going to give the floor to Laurence-MÉHAIGNERIE, Chair of the Committee of Sustainable Development Land Management of the French National Assembly.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Speaker of the House of Commons, ladies and gentlemen, presidents, dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to open this session, the afternoon session, and to speak about the funding of world climate policies. On behalf of the French delegation, I'd like to thank the Italian Parliament and the IPU for having taken the initiative to gather us in Rome to prepare COP26. Combating global warming is definitely the great challenge of our times. Us being here today confirms the consensus around the importance of this. Our citizens are already seeing the dramatic consequences of climate catastrophes in Asia, in Europe, and in Africa, and Oceania. Nobody is spared. And first and foremost, the vulnerable communities and indigenous populations. It is a crisis which concerns the whole of the planet, and for some people it is a matter of outright survival. We have the responsibility of finding solutions right now, and the first of the solutions is to apply the Paris Agreement, which establishes goals and puts forward a method. We know that the climate crisis requires heavy investments. Mechanisms have been developed by the 2009 Copenhagen conference and the Paris Agreement 2015. The question we have to ask ourselves is simpler. Where do we stand with this funding? Are we keeping our commitments? The Paris Agreement, as you know, marked a major step forward, stating that developed countries must take the initiative to provide financial aid in climate matters to less wealthy countries. The first question is the overall amount of funds needed. It is huge. In order to comply with the goals of the Paris Agreement, the World Bank has estimated that 81,000 to 90,000 billion dollars will be necessary for the period 2015-2030. That's a minimum of 5.4 thousand billion per year. So the worldwide need goes well beyond the public investments which have been established in the Paris Agreement. And secondly, the funding of worldwide measures requires not just public funding, but also, and this is very important, that private funds also be channeled towards these requirements. How can we keep to our commitments? What we need to give to the most vulnerable people and to the future generations? There are two things which are important. First of all, a commitment to raise $100 million on the part of wealthier countries per year in order to help adaptation and mitigation in weaker countries. According to a report last September, about 69% of this has been raised. Obviously, the wealthy countries haven't complied with their commitments. Developing countries, on their part, consider this as a question of mutual confidence. For them, this is going to be an essential point in COP26 in Glasgow. The second mechanism is the Green Fund, Green Climate Fund, and that involves two mechanisms. For a developing country, this involves obtaining a guarantee that climate contributions on the part of developed countries will be added to existing development aid, and that they point out that the climate problem historically is a responsibility of developed countries. Developed countries, on their part, have an interest in involving developing countries in combating greenhouse gas emissions, channeling funds towards energy transition. The initial mobilization of the Green Fund was $10.3 billion. This was re-established for the first time in October 29, with $9.7 billion from 27 countries. Many of them promised that they would double their contribution, including the UK, Germany, Norway, and France. Germany, a number of these countries, as I said, have promised to double their contribution. The new American administration has committed $1.2 billion in addition, which was marked a contribution on the part of the United States, which was very much expected. These are the mechanisms of funding for the future climate agreements. You will have noticed that whatever the impact of actions already undertaken, these are very far from responding to the needs which have been assessed by the World Bank of thousands of billions of dollars. So there are considerable investment required, and there is considerable anxiety about the greater speed of climate change than was expected. And so we need to make our whole system compatible with the climate goals we've set ourselves. What's the relationship with the Paris Agreement? The decision is very ambitious. It says that funds should be directed to low carbon activities. I would just restrict myself here to quoting the action which has been carried out at European level. Concretely, this means establish measures for establishing carbon rates and promoting green growth. It also means allocating 30% of our development plans to the green economy, and also measures to assess the climate effects of public financing, something France has done. And there's also an important change in investment institution. The European Central Bank in June 2021 established a roadmap to become a climate bank, directing its investments and funding towards climate policies. The European Investment Bank has also made a program to involve climate measures in its monetary measures in order to change the behavior of the financial compartment. Other initiatives exist, such as initiatives of the European Commission to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, and the International Platform on Sustainable Financing launched by the European Community, or the idea to stop all new investments in carbon. The green economy is still something which is just surfacing. In 2019, 0.5% of investments were in coal-based energy and 60% in gas and oil, and only a small part towards renewable energy. Therefore, there is still a long way to go. The harmonization of reporting techniques and a common classification in the international community are therefore very important things to achieve. COP26, opening next month in Glasgow, will definitely be a very important stage in order to reassure developing countries on the commitment of developed countries to raise $100 billion and also undertake decisions on funding after 2025. There also need to be a discussion on the involvement of non-state actors, and therefore one of the important factors is keeping to our commitments. Madam and Mr. Presidents and dear colleagues, as Jean Monnet pointed out, people only accept change when it is necessary, and you see a need when there's a crisis. Currently, we see a crisis, and therefore we need to convince our citizens, but also listen to them, because often they have interesting ideas, particularly on the local level. And as I said previously, my great concern is the greater speed in which the climate is deteriorating. Are we going to be fast enough in our policies for ecological transitions? Question I leave with you, and I thank you for your attention.
I now give the floor to Vera SONGWE of the United Nations, Under Secretary of the General Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa and the United Nations. Ms. SONGWE.
Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking the Italian Parliament and also thanking the Interparliamentary Union for having this meeting today. Mr. President of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, Mr. Alberti Casellati, President of the Italian Senate, Ms. And of course, the Speaker of the British House of Commons, Mr. Lindsay HOYLE, and my co-panelists today, Madame Laurence MAILLART-MÉHAIGNERIE, Chair of the Committee of Sustainable Development and Land Management. We are here today to talk about, I think, a topic that is quite important and for which many, in particular Africans, are already living the consequences. Today, on average, many African countries spend anywhere between 5 to 11% of their gross domestic product addressing the problems of climate change. So actually, as we talk about funding global policies for climate change, a lot of the calculations of how we fund climate change do not take into account the resources that the African countries spend on responding to climate events. And my sense is that they are already spending, since the Paris Agreement, anywhere between 25 to 50 billion of own resources on addressing the impacts of climate change. So it is a particularly important topic for Africa. A just and inclusive energy transition, which is part of the biggest debates today on climate change, requires a scaled-up finance in Africa for renewable energy grid systems, storage, and climate. For Africa, it is about dealing with the climate pressures today, but ensuring that we can create jobs and create a prosperous continent. The conversation on climate change is a conversation that ends with a discussion about jobs, a discussion about prosperity, and a discussion about equity. We believe that energy is fundamental to that conversation. As part of that conversation as well is how we do a just and equitable transition from Africa's energy sources today, which are mostly hydro actually, to a much more renewable and sustainable energy source. Part of that includes gas as its mix. And we have just seen in the last week, anyone who's been reading the Financial Times, I think if you were reading the Financial Times on Monday and Tuesday, Europe was getting into a crisis. And the stock markets went up because we believed that there was going to be another economic recession in Europe. But then we got gas from Russia, which came back into the market, reduced the prices, and then we believe growth will happen again. This is the importance of gas as a transition. We cannot overlook that in Africa as well. Today, the rich countries, the United States, China, Japan, and large parts of Asia still use gas as a fundamental part of their energy transition. However, as we talk about financing of climate change, there is already an acceptance that gas should not be funded, gas development should not be funded on the continent. We believe that this is not a fair, equitable, or just process. We believe that gas as a transition for Africa in particular, but for the developing world in general, is an important component of this conversation. We still have multilateral companies spending billions of dollars exploring for gas in the continent and then using it in the developed world. But we do not have gas exploration in the developing world for the developing world. And that is part, I think, of a conversation that we must have. In many of Africa's largest economies, such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania, annual electricity consumption is under 200 kilowatts per person, less than the ordinary refrigerator in any developed country. To meet Africa's huge and growing energy needs requires universal access to basic access to energy, which can create jobs. Africa just passed the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The European Union and the UK are huge members of Africa's trading platform. And of course, we would want to continue that industrialization, but to do that, we will need some base energy. And so as we talk about the transition, we must look at what is it that works for Africa as a way out of this transition. We must also remember that for Africa, a lot of the populations have not yet invested in any kind of energy. And so essentially, this is going to be the first step of how that investment happens. How do we finance this? Africa is also a store of a lot of the carbon that we need. If you look at the pitlands in the Congo Basin, we are the second largest conserver of carbon in the world. And that's where I totally agree with Ms. Maillard. We need a price for carbon. There is no use talking about 100 billion. 100 billion is not enough, and 100 billion has not come. We need a market price. We need to level the playing field. We need to move away from a contribution that is donor-funded to a market mechanism that allows for those who can pay for the price, who can pay for pollution, to pay for it, and for it to be transparent. And I fully agree with you, we need a regulatory system that allows for transparency in the carbon pricing and in the carbon emissions. I think since Paris, we've been talking about 100 billion. My sense is it's probably larger than 100 billion, but we haven't made the 100 billion. What we also know is that the private sector has the resources to be able to pay for some of this. So I think justifiably, we should move the debate from a debate that we have seen is not yet delivering for those who live in Africa, who are paying the brunt, 11% of GDP in Mozambique, to respond to the climate crisis. And we keep talking about the Paris commitment. Let's just put a price on carbon. If we put a price on carbon, Mozambique, our suggestion is to say, put a price on carbon, create a fund, an African fund at least, maybe a emerging markets fund, that allows us to be able to then use those resources to ensure that we can do the roads, we can do the electricity, we can do, for God's sakes, the pharmaceutical that we need to be able to respond to this health crisis that we have. We believe that a transparent, market-based mechanism for funding climate change is probably the best one. We know that the public sector, the donor sector, the aid sector will never be able to create and generate the resources that are needed. And the incentive does not lie with the public sector. The incentive lies with the private sector. So it's a particularly important point. The second point is we have heard, including from Mark Carney and many of the bright people working in the field of climate change, that the markets have $13 trillion. We've seen, I think, over the last 6 months, a lot of global firms where the boards have been saying you need to invest more in carbon. However, if you are an African country, or even if you're a Latin American country, if you go to the markets and issue a bond, if it's a plain vanilla bond, maybe your spreads are the same, but there is not a big difference between a plain vanilla bond and a green bond emission. So in Africa, for example, there's about $359 billion of green bonds that have been emitted worldwide. Africa only accounts for $2 billion of that. Latin America, about $8 billion, because there is not yet an incentive. The spreads between the market plain vanilla bonds and the green bonds for many of the advanced emerging market economies is not that large because there is no incentive to do it. I think if we can regulate that system, again, the market is willing to buy those bonds, the market is willing to invest, but to the public sector, and I think distinguished members of the Parliament, is to create the regulatory framework, create the transparent analysis that allows us to differentiate between what is green, what is not green, and how we can finance it. And I think that is what the developing world is waiting for, is transparency in that process, a level playing field in the carbon pricing process, in the carbon emissions process. In Africa today, most African countries no longer do coal. So yes, we're happy that many of the bigger, I think we welcome the Japanese conversation about no longer funding coal in developing countries. We welcome the Chinese declaration about no longer funding coal in the developing countries. But if you don't fund coal there and you fund coal back at home, we still bear the brunt. So we need to work to see whether we can stop funding coal globally and ensure that the mothers in Central Africa, for example, that are keeping and sequestering carbon are not paying for more coal that is being developed further afield. These are, I believe, Excellencies, members of Parliament, the International Parliamentary Union, the most important things: a market-based, transparent pricing mechanism for carbon, we believe, is what is going to begin to create the trillions that are needed to help the developing countries, and in particular Africa, realize its goal of becoming a part of a prosperous world. Thank you very much for your attention.
I will now invite delegates to join the debate in accordance with conference rules and in order to allow the greatest possible participation. Please keep your contributions to 2 minutes. I've already received indications of speakers and heads of delegations that will intervene in the debate according to the list that was shared yesterday. Each time I will announce the name of the country of the next speaker, as well as the country that will follow them. So what I would say is, please, when we get to 2 minutes, I start ringing the bell. That's the end of the speech. We need to keep to time in order to allow others to their contribution. So please, don't be selfish. It's a 2-minute rule, not my rule, but conference rules. So let us start with the second Vice President of the Senate of Burundi. Vice President.
On behalf of Burundi, first of all, I would like to greet the organizers of this conference. Burundi, like many other countries, has already begun to implement the Paris Agreement starting in January 2016 and has updated its NDC. Burundi, as many other countries, has already begun to implement the Paris Agreement as of January 2016, hence it has updated its NDC in order to try to respond to the decision to restrict global warming to 2 degrees centigrade and possibly 1.5. Currently, we are evaluating the implementation of the NDCs for all countries signatories to the convention and also presenting new NDCs at the national level. Financial sector, the private financial sector has to help enterprises to transform their economic model, align their investments with the goal of carbon neutrality and also publish progress made. Owners and managers of assets must decarbonize their portfolios. International financial institutions and national development banks must raise funds and private investment for developing countries. And developed countries need to keep their commitment of raising $100 billion every year for developing countries starting in 2020. Our goal is to go beyond that and to go beyond the $100 billion in 2021 and to revise international public funding after that. Thank you.
We now go to the member of the Chamber of Deputies from Argentina.
We attribute great importance to this international discussion, and we're very much in line with the analysis made and the issues which involve us all. We'd like to express our view from the Global South and our view from the Latin American homeland. We cannot speak with climate crisis without speaking of inequality, exploitation, and concentration of wealth. And in view of this, we ask ourselves whether, if everybody here today is ready to respond to this challenge and to commit ourselves not only to the letter of the declaration, but also to the actions involved, because we think it is necessary to realize that the climate fund is creating new inequalities in addition to the old ones, and therefore we have to improve implementation to make sufficient resources available to developing countries. So we wish not to speak of grants or donations, but to speak in terms of international justice. We need to create a fair process of transition where the commitments taken to fund actions in our countries are complied with, and that proposals such as cancelling international debt because of the climate warming, because we were also debtors because of the exploitation of our resources, and that common but differentiated responsibilities are accepted, and it be understood that the main global problem is inequality and poverty, and that a type of environmentalism which is based on people and which is holistic, because in order to create a fairer world, we need to carry out these actions collectively. If combating poverty and inequality was previously an ethical requirement, now it's something which is necessary for the survival of the planet. Thank you.
Cyprus.
Dear colleagues, the response of science and technology during the COVID-19 pandemic and the success in creating effective vaccines in record time has set a positive example as to what advancement should be made towards the development of low-carbon technologies. In addition, the policy responses of governments to the COVID-19 crisis have demonstrated that major economies are capable of unprecedented and radical action when their citizens' well-being is threatened. In order for the world to clear itself from all forms of fossil fuel subsidies and to radically decarbonize our economies, a substantial scaling up of investment over the next 2 decades is required. The shift to renewables, new electricity networks, energy efficiency, and low-carbon mobility offers a huge investment opportunities as well as greater potential for growth and job creation. Governments can provide the infrastructure to support the deployment of low-carbon technologies in response to carbon pricing. In the same context, financial sector policies such as green taxonomies and common risk disclosures can steer private investment towards sustainable projects. Climate change is a global challenge that requires urgent global action. We know what must be done, and the time to do it is now. And look ahead to COP26. We must be ready to move decisively together for saving our planet and for building a more sustainable future for our citizens and generations to come.
Can I remind all members that they must wear a mask when speaking? I know it may be an hindrance, but we've got to stick to the rules of conference. We're now coming to the chairperson of the Parliamentary Caucus on Climate Change of the Senate of Pakistan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the International Parliamentary Union for organizing this meeting. I realize the time is very short, and global inequality and carbon neutrality are two things that seem to be irreconcilable for the current future that we are looking towards. The COVID pandemic, ladies and gentlemen, has taught us two important lessons: that current levels of inequality and climate change mitigation and adaptation are not sustainable. We are slipping from those goals, and responsibility has not been shared. The second most important thing COVID should have taught us, that no country is an island. Neither biodiversity nor declines in biodiversity or bacteria, as well as climate change, know no borders. So if one country suffers, eventually climate stress will take up and catch up with them. Now, what is Pakistan doing? Pakistan is a 1% polluter in the global net emissions. A 1% polluter is now facing the ranking of the 5th most vulnerable country to climate change, particularly in air quality, yet we are not facing any kind of climate funding that is anywhere remotely equal. What we are doing is looking for green financing and debt swaps, as well as a nature performance bond. But I completely agree with the speaker from Africa who said that private financing is critical. Put a price on carbon. What have we done about it? We have just launched, with private capital, the world's largest mangrove reforestation project in the world. This is private equity, and it's called Indus Delta Capital. It is in partnership with one of the provinces of Sindh, and the government of Pakistan is focused on moving forward towards carbon neutrality and sequestration.
We now go to the National Assembly of Central African Republic. Wherever they are.
Muy buenas tardes.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, the Central African Republic plans on becoming an emerging economy by 2030. We plan on becoming a modern country open to the world, using all the technologies available. Our country is one of the poorest countries in the world at the moment. And at the moment, we do not have any mitigation obligations. But we do want to show an example. Despite our need to develop our economy, we want to fight against our carbon emissions and reduce them by 2030 and even further by 2050. We do have a role to play when it comes to improving the climate change situation, and we're going to do this by voting on and passing strategies and policies at the national level. We want to make sure that the most vulnerable and worst off countries have access to climate financing. Parliamentary colleagues, I would like to conclude by asking for your support so that we can have active support so that there is a full lifting of sanctions against our country that are currently in place. The environment is very important for health. Thank you very much.
We now go to the National Assembly of Slovenia.
Okay. Dear colleagues, MPs, we have heard a lot about the environment in last years, but we also less results. For Slovenia, a green country, is at utmost importance that we put solutions in actions. And on behalf of the Slovenian presidency to the Council of the EU, let me say that we put great importance to COP26 and in this meeting of parliamentarians. Also, I would like to stress out that the message of youth is clear. They will help us, we just have to listen and we have to work. This topic of the environment, if you wish, topic of life, was important yesterday, it is important today, and it will be important in future. We must act now, we must create policies and actions for our air, our oceans, our planet, because it's the only one. And now we are at the turning point, to stay at this course and destroy the livable environment, or turn around, step back, and help our planet to regenerate. These actions won't be easy. We will all have to do things that not everybody will like, because those actions will affect our way of living, but all these actions are necessary. So each country has to do its own homework to make green policies, allocate funds accordingly, especially big polluters, But without great cooperations between nations, we won't succeed no matter what. We must understand that changes won't happen overnight, but sooner than we start, the better. Although we are a couple of decades late. Just paying the price is not enough. We must stop repeating our mistakes. Wish the world the best. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is from the House of Lords of the United Kingdom.
Fellow delegates, there is a chant amongst children in the UK that says, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." And it is from the mouths of babes and children that one hears the truth. Young people are right. Words alone will not undo the deep damage to our planet. So the section on finance on the COP26 website fills me with anger. Phrases such as, "One of the key deliverables of the first phase of the task force is to develop and trial a new approach to climate finance in 5 pioneer countries." Delegates, Rome was not, or may not have been built in a day, but this statement conveys no sense of the desperation of low-lying states. And juxtapose that against the trillions invested in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And quite frankly, this is obscene. We have to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Putting any more into our atmosphere denigrates us as stewards of this beautiful planet. But yet, if used wisely, money can move mountains, and the mountain that needs to be moved is political will. So my message to leaders of the rich world is simple. Use your policy and regulatory powers to do 2 things. Stop the subsidies and ensure that financial decisions to invest in fossil fuels reflect fully the risk of stranded assets. And secondly, do what is morally right and make reparations to those nations that suffer because of the profits you have made by burning fossil fuels. If politics is the art of the possible, then you must make it possible to hand over this planet as a going concern to future generations. Thank you.
We now go to the member of the Transitional National Council of Mali. Speaker from Mali. Oh, dear. If not, we'll go to the member of the Committee on the Environment of the Italian Senate.
Grazie.
Thank you. Mechanisms to assess the sustainability of EU spending should fully comply with good practice for sustainable finance, respecting the principle of not doing significant harm, and science-based environmental and social criteria, like those developed for the EU taxonomy. We have seen that there is no consistent and binding requirement on all activities receiving EU financing to apply the principle of not doing any significant harm. The Commission should apply this principle to its entire budget and include in a draft financial regulation, a new financial regulation, this same principle of not doing significant harm. And also fully integrate the criteria of the EU taxonomy as these become available in the methodology of the EU in climate tracking. Many thanks. I've finished.
We now go to the member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The COVID pandemic made us realize how interconnected and interdependent we are. We realized we cannot all be well until every single person on this earth is well. The same goes for the environment, of course. And as the Great National Assembly of Turkey, we just ratified the Paris Agreement 2 days ago. I didn't get a chance to vote because I was here. But we also have a long-term aim of bringing emissions to zero by 2053. The COVID pandemic demonstrates the importance of delivering a greener and more resilient growth in the face of global risks and challenges. We need to tackle climate change urgently, but we need to do it standing in solidarity and ensure that not a single person is left behind. And we also need to share the burden all together, the developed and developing countries together. We have to help each other out. During the 76th General Assembly of United Nations, President Erdogan said, "Whoever has done the most damage to nature, to our atmosphere and our water, our soil and the earth, and whoever has wildly exploited natural resources should also make the greatest contribution to fight against climate change." We can do this all together. A fairer world is possible, but we have to all take our responsibility, because this world will be after we will exist after we all are gone, and we owe this to the future generations. Thank you.
We now come to the Chair of the Natural Resources of the Committee of the Chamber of Deputies of Argentina.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many things have been said. I think we can all agree that climate change is a huge issue, and we agree that not all countries have had the same responsibility when it comes to emitting carbon dioxide. It has been said by previous speakers as well. That's why we do have common but differentiated responsibilities. The COVID-19 pandemic has also exacerbated existing problems and inequalities. The challenge we have that lies ahead of us is huge. We need to build this transition. We are responsible for making sure that this transition is a just one. That's why we'd like to make sure that we work on the debts as well, the environmental debts between the North and the global South of the world. We need to work on equality here. Our countries need to look after a lot of environmental resources and natural resources. This is a lot of responsibility. We have made some proposals for debt exchange mechanisms, for example. We have proposed to have certain financing, not just for mitigation, but also adaptation. And to do this, we need to work together. And Pope Francis spoke very well this morning when he said we need to have solidarity. We need to act now. We don't have any time left because we have no planet B. Thank you.
We now come to the member for the Senate of Ireland.
Thank you very much, and it's my very great honour to be here with you today. I'm from a very small island nation, as you'll know, Speaker, from the western side of Europe, and I suppose we're in a position where you would expect that we would be very much to the forefront when it comes to climate action, and I think we are getting there. But we are a temperate climate, and I think that has allowed us a certain level of complacency, and I've been listening very attentively to the last few speakers and indeed to speakers yesterday, and what's really clear is that a sense of trust needs to be established. or re-established when it comes to developed and developing worlds, nations, because we are hearing the same stories over and over again. We are hearing that there's a lack of commitment when it comes to the climate fund, and that it's not actually working. When we look at coronavirus, we do pat ourselves on the back and we say we've done a great job as a planet when it comes to coronavirus, but we've also failed and discussed over and over a TRIPS waiver and not got there. And so how do we expect developing world countries to believe us when we say we are all in this together? It's not just about the words. I would like to think that we will all leave here today, and the people that I speak to later on over coffee will believe me when I say we are all in this together. This isn't a talking shop. We're leaving COP26 with real commitments, and we have learnt the lessons from coronavirus. Thank you very much.
We now come to the member of the Chamber of Deputies of the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic.
Muy buenas tardes.
A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Speaker, colleagues. Green recovery. This is the responsibility of all countries in the world. And the most developed countries need to support the developing countries when it comes to protecting their ecosystems. Many developing countries are putting in place sustainability programs, and these need to be supported. Every action starts with a small step, and that's what we need to keep doing, making these small steps. One of the most important measures to save our ecosystem is investment in education, but not just in relation to the issue we are seeing here today and talking about today. We need to talk about very small issues which and actions which add to emissions of carbon dioxide. We see that in many developing countries there is a lack of education and awareness, so we need to make sure there is more awareness in relation to ecosystems and protecting ecosystems and making them sustainable. Some countries cannot develop properly. This is a huge issue. Thank you very much.
We now come to the member of the Italian Senate.
What we need is a new economic model and also a new ecological model. I would say an ecology which must be fair and supportive, because the crisis we're facing is not just a climate crisis, but is clearly a structural crisis. And we find ourselves faced by health, environmental, economic, financial, and social problems. And the finance we're talking about today has to be guided and governed in the same way that the market must be. Because the pandemic has raised a serious problem. It's made us understand that the economic model we've been applying so far no longer works. And underpinning the economic ecological model, there lies environmental sustainability. We have to protect natural capital. We have to pay attention to the scarcity of resources. We have to slow down the entropy of the system. We have to mitigate climate change, adapt also to what has already occurred. And we need to improve the number of decent jobs by reducing also working hours and perhaps also giving importance to useful green jobs and promoting social inclusion. What I ask you is that finance, not just public finance and private finance, can be directed properly. I'm saying this because in many national recovery and resilient plans, I haven't seen any innovative approaches, models which actually combine physical and economic variables going beyond GDP. So I think it's important to change our methods and have a new outlook. Thank you.
We now come to the chair of the Committee on the Environment of the Mexican Senate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
A very good afternoon to everyone. One of the most significant challenges is having accountability and having access to financing. In recent years, we have seen the effects of climate change, floods, droughts, extreme weather events, food insecurity, etc., etc. It's very important for all parties to the Paris Agreement to put in place mechanisms to ensure that financing can reach the most vulnerable countries. The countries which are affected most by climate change and emissions are those that emit the least greenhouse gases. Financing needs to go to adaptation, not just mitigation. It's very important that this finance gets to vulnerable countries. We also invite developed countries to scale up their use of renewable energies and to focus on energy efficiency and focus on renewable energies in general. In our country, we have created a carbon market, for example, trying to reduce emissions, and we are also trying to implement other measures to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. We are committed to strengthening risk management and putting in place management policies with regards to managing climate financing. We think that more funding needs to be mobilized in relation to fighting against deforestation and other important issues. That's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
We now come to the member of the Arab Parliament, Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, President, distinguished Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dear delegates, allow me to address you in Arabic. I would like to start with the words of His Royal Highness Salman, saying that we understand how to undertake our responsibility in the world in combating the climate change. We aim to ensure stability in the market of oil and gas, and we will lead the green recovery. End of quote. One of the most important initiatives we have is the Green Saudi and the Green Middle East. This reflects our orientation towards saving the land and the nature. Our initiatives aim to increase the plant cover and to reduce carbon emissions, to combat pollution in the same way. This will also be leading to the production of clean energy. In Saudi Arabia, we understand the responsibility to address climate change, and we play this role and undertake the responsibility by enacting laws and putting in place legislations in line with international agreements and instruments. We all acknowledge that the climate crisis is without boundaries and cannot be addressed by one party alone. It requires collective efforts. Thank you.
We now go to the member of the National Assembly of France.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. colleagues, I think we are approaching a very fundamental part of our negotiations here, and that's the point of the need for solidarity as we face climate change. We have seen that no one is spared here. We can see these things happening in Europe, in Australia, but it must be said that it is the poorest countries, the most vulnerable countries, that are affected most by climate change. 80% of carbon emissions come from G20 countries. This requires us to show solidarity because we are faced with this paradox. The developing countries have little financing and they need to make huge efforts to fight against climate change. So we need to go further. We need to have solidarity because we, the rich countries, over 50, 100 years, we have had an industrial model which has meant that today we are responsible for 80% of all emissions. And that's why now we need to increase international solidarity. This is an essential point. This meeting in Glasgow will show the world this huge paradox. We will see that the rich countries have a huge responsibility, especially when it comes to the Green Climate Fund, but also in regards to other policies. We need to show solidarity. Thank you very much.
We now come to the first Vice President of the National Assembly of the Congo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers who've made it possible for us to take the floor on such an essential point. In Congo, we belong to what is called the Congo Basin with six other countries of the region. You know that the Congo Basin is the second most environmental area in the world, with its huge carbon sink areas, and the basin of the Congo is the heart of biodiversity with its 135 million hectares distributed among 6 countries. We have around 70% of the forest coverage of the continent and 1/5 of all living species on our planet. And it is to preserve this huge environmental treasure from uncontrolled exploitation. The 6 countries have come together in the Climate Committee of the Congo Basin and have decided to propose the creation of a fund to respond to climate change called the Blue Fund for the Congo Basin. This funding tool, advanced by SONGWE, the Vice President of the Republic of the Congo, has makes a major contribution to sustainable development in the amount of 8 billion euros. This is very important in conserving the forest of the Congo Basin. And so we wish to say here that we must therefore become aware of the danger which weighs on humanity, so that we move from words to facts for the funding of these various projects which can save the future of our planet. Thank you.
We now come to the chairperson of the National Assembly of South Africa. South Africa.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker and Honourable Members. As we are aware that the commitment of countries to the Paris Agreement is locked up in the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. What is most significant about the current updated NDC is the 2030 target range from South Africa, which is consistent with our fair share and also an ambitious improvement on our current NDC target. The upper range of the proposed 2030 target represents a 28% reduction in greenhouse gases emissions from the 2015 NDC targets. This means that South Africa aims to emit 28% less than what was proposed in its original NDC 5 years ago, and we believe that is quite significant. However, we also believe in a just transition. To move away from this current status quo and to achieve our new NDC targets will require a significant amount of support, and that support will have to be forthcoming and enabled by finance and technology as well as capacity building support. In terms of the just transition, we believe that no one must be left behind. Our poor people cannot be left behind as we transition. And as part of that transition, and I think one of the presenters mentioned it, is the issue as we transition from coal, that gas will have to play a role. It cannot be a clear break from the current base load to something else. And that is our commitment that we are giving, and we count on the support of the international financial and technical institutions. Thank you very much.
We now come to the Senate of Pakistan.
Thank you. Pakistan has made great efforts in fighting climate change. We became the only country in the world to meet the international bond challenge. The target was of restoring over 350,000 hectares of land into forest, and Pakistan restored over 600,000 hectares of land into forest, planted over 1 billion trees in the KP province, and now we have committed to plant 10 billion trees across the country within next 3 years. Out of that 10 billion trees, Pakistan has already planted over 1 billion trees in the country. Pakistan also met the UN climate goal, SDG 13, and that too, a decade before the deadline. Now, Pakistan's contribution towards fighting climate change are commendable. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Imran Khan, we have taken several initiatives like the 10 billion tree project, Clean and Green Pakistan, Clean Green Pakistan Index, Protected Areas Initiative, electrification of transportation, and also Ecosystem Restoration Fund. Pakistan contributes less than 1% of the global greenhouse emissions, but yet we are constantly among the top 10 countries impacted by climate change. Developed countries need to help developing countries. Thank you.
I would like now to come to our two panelists to sum up. Keynote speakers, would you like to now come back? Madam, are you okay? Okay, and that's great. Okay. No. What I would like to say is, look, parliamentarians have a key role to play in realising the commitments made under the Paris Agreement by ensuring that funding and resources are invested effectively to support climate action, and the domestic plans and policies account for the most vulnerable. In addition to their responsibilities for translating global agreements into the national legislation or monitoring their implementation, parliaments are responsible for adopting national budgets, making sure national budgets and expenditure are in line with the national and international climate commitments. And as our keynote speaker quoted at the beginning, people accept change if they see a crisis. We are in a crisis. So parliamentary actions across the world are key. And I've got to say that we are united in this chamber today. It brings us together. But as we know, action will always speak louder than words. And I would say that we are united. But when we go back to our own countries, we must stand firm. We must stand in solidarity and remind people words are fine, but actions are better. And each country must take that responsibility serious. It is no use one country having a good idea. Knowledge is power, but sharing knowledge and power will make the difference to save this planet. We have one chance and one chance only. So please, food security matters. We must feed people, but it must be sustainable. Energy is the crisis for all. Water is a crisis for all. We've got to work together to ensure that people will be fed, they will be warm, and they have the rights to clean water. So it's about ensuring that we have a sustainable planet. This is a one chance, and no other chance will we have to save the planet and the world that we know. It is so, so precious to us all. So please, colleagues, let us take the fine words, let's take them back, but let's turn them into the actions that will make the difference. So I've got to say, we reached the end of this panel discussion. It's been absolutely stimulating for me to be able to chair it. I've got to say that the next panel will start shortly. So please, we're going to have a very short intervention to allow you to have a comfort break. But please, let's stick together. Thank you, conference. Right, do you want to take the floor, sir?